Hello, and welcome. Today we will walk through a broad and necessary idea. Could you accept that your deepest certainties were born from natural limits? Everything you know about the universe could be wrong. Ever since the human species began interpreting reality, that interpretation has been shaped by a small, slow, local environment, incapable of reflecting the true scale of the cosmos. As the scale expands, those certainties begin to waver. The light that reaches us carries accumulated time. The stage where events unfold is not neutral. The rhythm of the universe is not singular, and much of what exists never presents itself directly to our senses. Our experience of reality reveals itself as fragmented and incomplete. Throughout this journey, we will cross the limits of human perception, understand why every observation carries delay, explore the active nature of space, feel the flexibility of time, and accept the invisible vastness that sustains the cosmos. Between measured facts and theoretical constructions, science will emerge as a bridge, not a denial, guiding the imagination into a territory where fully understanding everything was never the rule. But before we continue, I need your help. If this kind of reflection speaks to you, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe so you do not miss future journeys, and share it with someone who would enjoy it as well. That small gesture makes a real difference and helps Cosmos for Rest continue bringing calm, thoughtful explorations of the universe. Now relax, close your eyes, and let science guide you. Long before any attempt to understand the universe as a whole, the human mind had already learned to operate within very specific limits. These limits were not consciously chosen, nor defined by intellectual curiosity. They emerged as a direct response to the demands of survival. The world that shaped human thought was immediate, nearby, and repetitive. Within it, the primary need was not to understand reality in depth, but to respond efficiently to what was around. Intuition is born precisely from this setting. As a silent adaptation to a restricted environment, human experience has always been anchored in reduced scales. The body moves across short distances, interacts with objects of similar size, and responds to stimuli that occur within intervals compatible with its own biological rhythms. Lived time is marked by natural cycles, by gradual aging, by the repetition of day and night. Nothing in this context requires an understanding of extremes. Nothing calls for explanations about the very large, the very distant, or the very ancient. The world as it is lived appears coherent, predictable, and stable. That stability builds trust. When something happens the same way repeatedly, the mind learns to expect that it will continue happening that way. This expectation does not need to be put into words. It settles in as a feeling. Intuition begins to operate as a reliable shortcut between perception and decision. There is no room for prolonged doubt when a quick response can ensure continuity. Intuition, therefore, is not a mistake. It is an extremely efficient solution for the environment in which it was created. Space, in this local experience, presents itself as a passive setting. It seems to exist only to accommodate events. Objects occupy positions, move from one place to another, and space remains the same before and after. This impression is reinforced because, at the human scale, transformations of space are imperceptible. Nothing in daily life suggests that the stage itself might actively participate in events. Thus, space is internalized as a neutral backdrop. Time, in turn, is felt as a continuous flow. It seems to advance always at the same pace, regardless of what happens. Subjective experience creates the sense of a uniform stream, where events arrange themselves in a clear sequence. Past, present, and future appear as natural, obvious, almost inevitable categories. This organization works so well for everyday life that it is rarely questioned. Time, as perceived, becomes an absolute reference within human experience. These impressions combine to form an intuitive view of the world. A view where reality is solid, space is fixed, time is uniform, and events follow a direct logic of cause and effect. This view does not arise from deep reflection, but from the absence of reasons to doubt it. As long as everything works as expected, there is no incentive to seek alternative explanations. Intuition becomes the default lens through which reality is interpreted. Language reinforces this process. The words available to describe the world are born from everyday experience and carry its limitations. When we say near or far, fast or slow, before or after, we are always referring to human comparisons, not universal properties. Even so, these words are used to speak about everything. including what has never been directly experienced. The mind begins to imagine the unknown using tools created for the known. Over time, this practice creates a sense of familiarity with the universe. The sky comes to be understood as a distant extension of the terrestrial environment. The stars appear as fixed points against a stable background. The cosmos seems merely larger, not different. This assumption is comfortable because it preserves the internal coherence of human experience. It does not require conceptual rupture. It does not challenge intuition. It simply expands the stage without altering its apparent rules. However, this expansion is illusory. What is being extended is not the understanding of reality, but the improper application of local rules to a domain that was not shaped by them. Intuition, by functioning well in everyday life, creates the impression that it is universal, but it carries no internal mechanisms to signal its own limits. It does not warn when it stops being reliable. It simply continues to operate in the same way, even when applied out of context. This is a crucial point. The failure is not in intuition, but in the expectation that it should explain everything. The human mind tends to trust what feels natural more than what demands cognitive effort. The familiar is comfortable. The unfamiliar generates resistance. That is why ideas that challenge intuition are often met with discomfort, even when they are coherent. Not because they are false, but because they require abandoning deeply rooted patterns. This resistance is not intellectual, but emotional. Intuition is tied to a sense of safety. It offers predictability. Questioning it can create the impression that the conceptual ground is being pulled away. Throughout history, this feeling has led many ideas to be rejected, not for lack of evidence, but for incompatibility with habitual ways of thinking. The mind protects its internal coherence before it protects abstract truth. It is important to understand that intuition did not evolve to comprehend the totality of reality. It evolved to ensure continuity within a specific environment. Expecting it to function outside that context is like expecting an instrument designed to measure small distances to remain precise at immense scales. The instrument is not wrong. It is simply being used beyond its range of validity. For most of human history, this did not pose a problem. Life unfolded without the need to understand the cosmos. Fundamental questions were local: where to find food, how to avoid danger, how to anticipate immediate changes in the environment. The universe, in this context, was a distant backdrop, not an object of systematic investigation. There was no urgency to question the intuitive foundations of perception. Only when curiosity moved beyond immediate survival did these foundations begin to be tested. Small inconsistencies appeared, motions that did not behave as expected, patterns that resisted simple explanation. These inconsistencies did not destroy intuition, but revealed its boundaries. They showed that what seemed universal was, in fact, local. Recognizing this locality is a delicate step. It is not about denying human experience, but about situating it. Intuition remains essential for living, for feeling, for acting in the immediate world, but it ceases to be the final judge of reality. This shift does not diminish the human being. On the contrary, it expands the capacity to relate to the unknown. By accepting that intuition is a local tool, space opens for other forms of understanding, forms that do not depend exclusively on direct experience, but are built through careful observation, comparison, inference, and disciplined imagination. This process does not replace intuition. It complements it. It recognizes its limits and works from them. This change in posture does not happen abruptly. It requires time, repetition, and a willingness to live with uncertainty. The human mind prefers clear answers, even when they are simplifications. Accepting that some certainties do not apply outside the context in which they arose is an exercise in humility, a humility that does not weaken, but strengthens the relationship with reality. From this recognition, it becomes possible to move beyond the everyday without internal conflict. The universe no longer needs to behave according to human expectations and becomes something that can be explored with patient curiosity. Intuition is not discarded, but repositioned. It continues to guide local life, while other tools begin to guide the understanding of the cosmos. This first adjustment is fundamental because it prepares the ground for everything that follows. Without it, each new idea would seem like an offense to common sense. With it, ruptures cease to be threats and become invitations. Invitations to understand that reality is not required to be intuitive, only consistent with itself. By recognizing that our deepest certainties were born from a small, slow, and nearby environment, something quietly reorganizes in the way of thinking. The question is no longer why the universe does not behave as we expect, but why we would expect it to behave that way. This inversion is subtle, but powerful. From here, the path opens to understand why, as scale expands, the universe begins to challenge everything that once seemed obvious. Not out of caprice, not by deliberate mystery, but because it was never shaped to fit within human intuition. And accepting this is the first step toward a more honest, broader, and more serene relationship with reality. There is a quiet sensation that accompanies almost all human experience, the sense that what reaches us happens at the very moment it is perceived. This sensation is rarely questioned because in everyday life it works. Events seem to coincide with perception. The sound of a nearby voice, the touch of an object, the movement of someone beside us arrive with delays so small that they never enter awareness. From this, the idea of a shared, stable, continuous present takes shape, as if the world and experience were always synchronized. This synchronization, however, is not a fundamental property of reality. It is simply a consequence of the scales in which human life unfolds. At short distances, the interval between an event and its perception is irrelevant. The body learns, from early on, to treat this coincidence as a rule. The present begins to feel like something objective, almost physical, as if it existed independently of the observer. Yet this impression begins to dissolve when scale extends beyond the immediate environment. Everything that reaches us from the distant universe travels. There is no direct access to what happens far away. There is only the transmission of information, and every transmission carries accumulated time. Light, which is the primary messenger of the cosmos, does not appear instantly at its destination. It moves through space. That journey transforms distance into delay. The greater the path, the greater the interval between the event and the moment it becomes perceptible. In everyday human experience, this interval is invisible. It does not interfere with decisions or with the sense of presence. That is why the mind learns to ignore it. But in the universe, this interval is not a negligible detail. It is the rule. What arrives from space never belongs to the same instant in which it is received. It is always old information, preserved during its journey. The sky, therefore, is not a window into the present, but a mosaic of pasts. This realization profoundly alters the nature of cosmic observation. When attention turns to distant regions, one is not following what is happening now, but coming into contact with earlier states of reality. Each accessible point carries a different age. What is closer arrives with less delay. What is farther away brings with it a more distant past. The universe never presents itself entirely within the same moment. The idea of a universal present begins then to lose meaning. There is no single instant shared by all observable regions. What can be called present in one place is not accessible as present in another. The now ceases to be a global entity and becomes a local construction, useful for organizing human experience, but incapable of describing the functioning of the cosmos. This temporal fragmentation is not merely conceptual, it is structural. No matter how advanced the instruments or how careful the observation, the delay can never be eliminated. It is inscribed in the very way information propagates. Even with perfect precision, the data would already arrive marked by time. Knowledge of the universe is born from the beginning, out of phase. This lag transforms the relationship between observer and reality. The universe is not observed directly. It is reconstructed. Each piece of information must be interpreted in light of the time it has traveled. Knowledge ceases to be a snapshot of the current state and becomes a historical reconstruction. Understanding the cosmos is always indirect, mediated, and inferential. This aspect is rarely felt emotionally because the mind insists on treating what it perceives as present. Even when it is intellectually understood that there is delay, subjective experience continues to react as if there were simultaneity. This insistence is not a cognitive failure, but a consequence of deeply rooted perceptual habits. The brain was not shaped to deal with information whose temporal origin does not match the moment of reception. As this understanding expands, something quietly changes in the way one relates to the universe. The expectation of following events in real time dissolves. In its place emerges the understanding that the cosmos is accessible only as an ongoing history. The focus shifts from the instant to the process. What matters is not the current state, but the trajectory. This shift requires abandoning the idea of a privileged point of observation. No location occupies the center of time. No perspective offers direct access to the cosmic present. Each position in the universe carries its own relationship to the observable past. Time ceases to be a uniform backdrop and becomes a dimension fragmented by distance. This fragmentation creates a curious effect. Different epochs coexist in human experience, but not in reality itself. What arrives at the same moment did not happen at the same moment. Perceived simultaneity is merely an alignment of arrivals, not of events. The sky becomes a living archive, where records from different times are received together, creating the illusion of temporal coexistence. This illusion runs deep because the human mind is trained to organize reality into linear narratives. The idea that multiple pasts can present themselves together challenges that linearity. Yet that is precisely what occurs. The universe does not reveal itself as an ordered sequence of instants, but as a superposition of histories. Accepting this transforms the very notion of knowledge. To know something about the universe does not mean to know how it is now, but to understand how it behaves over time. Cosmic knowledge is not instantaneous, it is cumulative. It is built through coherence between records, not through temporal coincidence. This historical character of knowledge does not make it fragile. On the contrary, it makes it deep. The delay allows access to processes that could never be followed directly. Changes too slow for human experience become perceptible when observed through records distributed across time. The lag, far from being an absolute obstacle, becomes a condition for understanding. Even so, the absence of a universal present imposes clear limits. There is no way to confirm the current state of distant regions. The universe is always one step ahead of perception. This distance cannot be eliminated, only acknowledged. And that acknowledgement requires a quiet revision of human expectations. The idea that the universe should be accessible in real time arises from projecting a local experience onto a reality that does not share that structure. When that projection is abandoned, the initial discomfort gives way to a more patient curiosity. The cosmos ceases to be something that must be followed and becomes something that can be understood in depth, even without direct access to the present moment. This understanding also dissolves the notion of cosmic urgency. If the universe never presents itself in the now, there is no rush to reach it. Knowledge does not depend on speed, but on consistency. Each new piece of information fits into a larger picture, built over time, respecting delay as part of the process. By accepting that we never observe the universe as it is in this instant, something adjusts in the relationship with the unknown. The frustration of not reaching the present transforms into calm acceptance. The cosmos does not hide out of hostility, but out of structure. It does not deny knowledge. It simply requires another form of approach. That form is not intuitive, but it is coherent. It recognizes that human experience is local, and that the universe does not share that locality. The now, so central to everyday life, loses its authority when applied to the cosmos. In its place arises a broader understanding, where time ceases to be a single thread and becomes a complex fabric. This shift prepares the ground for understanding even deeper breaks between intuition and reality. If the present is not universal, if observation is never immediate, then many silent certainties begin to dissolve. The universe is not a stage available in real time, but a continuous process, always one step beyond perception. And it is within this permanent distance between what happens and what arrives that the cosmos reveals its true nature, not as something that presents itself fully, but as something understood gradually, layer by layer, story by story, accepting that the human present is only a small island within a much greater ocean of time. For most of human history, space was understood as absence. Whatever was not occupied by an object seemed simply not to exist. Between one thing and another, there appeared to be only an interval without properties, a silent nothing that served merely to separate bodies. This idea did not arise from deep reflection, but from direct experience. In everyday human life, space does not react, does not resist, does not interfere in a perceptible way. It seems only to allow events to occur within it. This impression shaped one of the deepest certainties of human intuition, that space is a neutral stage. This notion works well as long as scales remain small. In a room, on a street, or across a natural landscape, Space does not seem to do anything beyond accommodating movement. When someone moves, space does not visibly transform. When an object falls, it appears simply to pass through space until it reaches the ground. Nothing suggests that the setting itself participates actively in the event. Thus, space is internalized as something passive, almost non-existent from a physical point of view. Over time, this intuition was extended to the cosmos. The universe came to be imagined as a vast emptiness, punctuated by islands of matter. Stars, planets, and galaxies seem to float in an infinite nothing. This image is powerful because it preserves everyday logic. Objects remain the protagonists, while space stays invisible and silent. The cosmos, in this view, is merely larger, not different. However, this familiarity begins to dissolve when local experience is no longer treated as an absolute reference. As investigation deepens, it becomes impossible to sustain the idea of a space that simply exists without participating. Space reveals properties of its own. It is not just a setting, but an active element of reality. This shift in perspective does not occur abruptly, but through an accumulation of clues that intuition alone cannot explain. One of these clues emerges when it becomes clear that the universe does not maintain fixed distances. The separations between large structures do not remain constant over time. They change. This simple fact is enough to shake the idea of space as something rigid and immutable. If distances transform, then space itself is involved in that transformation. It cannot be merely a neutral container. This perception requires a careful distancing from everyday language. When we say that something moves, intuition imagines an object crossing through an unmoving space. But at cosmic scales, this image becomes inadequate. What changes is not only the position of objects, but the very structure that defines those positions. Space begins to be understood as something that can stretch, reorganize, and influence how events unfold. The idea of absolute emptiness also begins to lose meaning. What seemed like absence reveals constant activity. Even where there is no visible matter, interactions, fluctuations, and effects occur that cannot be ignored. Nothingness ceases to be nothing. It becomes a rich, dynamic field, fundamental to the functioning of the universe. The apparent absence hides a complexity that escapes everyday experience entirely. This discovery does not directly confront common sense, it moves around it. Intuition is not wrong in perceiving space as silent in daily life. It simply does not perceive what lies beyond its sensitivity. Just as air once seemed non-existent before its presence was understood, space seemed empty before its structure was revealed. Silence does not indicate absence, only perceptual limitation. When this limitation is recognized, the relationship with the cosmos transforms. Space ceases to be something that separates and becomes something that connects. It influences trajectories, organizes movement, and conditions the behavior of matter. There is no event that occurs outside of space. It is not a container external to phenomena, but an integral part of them. Everything that happens unfolds in dialogue with space. This understanding profoundly alters the notion of movement. To move is no longer simply to change position within a fixed setting, but to interact with the very structure of reality. Space ceases to be conceptually invisible and begins to be recognized as a silent protagonist. It does not call attention to itself, but it is present in every transformation, every relation, every process. The difficulty in accepting this idea does not lie in the complexity of the concept, but in the rupture it demands from everyday intuition. The human mind insists on imagining space as something that could be removed without altering what happens within it. But such removal is impossible. Without space, there is no relation, no distance, no configuration. Space is not optional, it is constitutive. This realization also redefines what is meant by emptiness. Emptiness is not total absence, but a state with its own properties. It can influence behavior, store energy, and participate in cosmic dynamics. Even where no detectable particles exist, space remains active. It does not sleep. It does not switch off. It sustains reality in ways that completely escape human sensory experience. Over time, this new view demands a deep conceptual re-education. Everyday language proves insufficient to describe a space that is not a stage, but an actor. Words like inside, outside, between, and through must be used with care, because they carry local assumptions. Still, they are the only tools available. The challenge is not to abandon them, but to recognize their limits. This re-education does not happen all at once. It requires repetition, examples, careful metaphors, and above all, patience. The human brain prefers simple images. A passive void is easier to imagine than a dynamic space. Yet simplicity is not a criterion for truth. The universe does not need to be intuitive. It only needs to be consistent with itself. By accepting that space has physical properties, something quietly reorganizes in the understanding of reality. The separation between setting and event dissolves. Everything comes to be understood as part of an integrated system. The cosmos ceases to be a collection of isolated objects floating in nothing and becomes a continuous network of relations mediated by space. This shift also dissolves the idea of absolute isolation. Nothing is completely separate from everything else. Space connects, even when it seems to divide. It defines possibilities, limits, and paths. It influences without being noticed. It acts without announcing itself. This silent action is perhaps the most difficult aspect to internalize, precisely because it does not manifest directly in everyday experience. Over time, this new understanding creates a curious sensation. The universe feels less empty and more full, less silent and more active. What once seemed like absence reveals itself as constant presence. Nothingness ceases to be a threat or a mystery and becomes a foundation. There are no holes in reality, only regions where activity does not present itself to human senses. This perception does not eliminate strangeness, but reorganizes it. The unknown ceases to be an empty void and becomes a fertile field of possibilities. Space is no longer something to be ignored, but something to be respected as an essential part of how the cosmos functions. At the end of this conceptual shift, it becomes impossible to sustain the intuitive view of a universe made of things floating in nothing. The cosmos reveals itself as a dynamic totality, where even what seemed non-existent plays a fundamental role. Space is not the interval between events. It is the fabric in which everything is woven. This recognition does not end the mystery, but deepens contemplation. The universe is not less fascinating for being active at every level. On the contrary, it becomes more intimate, more connected, and more coherent. The void, which once seemed simple, reveals itself as one of the most misleading ideas of human intuition. And it is from this understanding that other silent certainties begin to dissolve. If space is not neutral, if it participates in reality, then many other seemingly obvious ideas will need to be revisited. The path continues forward not in search of final answers, but of a more honest relationship with what has always been present, even when it seemed absent. Throughout everyday life, time presents itself as something simple, constant, and predictable. It seems to advance at the same pace, indifferent to whatever happens. 1 minute always feels like another minute. 1 hour seems to carry the same weight as any other. This regularity creates the impression that time is a single, stable, universal flow, shared by everything that exists. This impression does not arise from reflection, but from habit. Nothing in ordinary experience requires time to be thought of differently. The human mind learns to organize reality based on this sensation. Events align in a clear sequence. Something happens, then something else happens. The past stays behind, the future seems to approach, and the present appears as an ever-accessible midpoint. This structure works so well in everyday life that it becomes one of the deepest certainties of human experience. Time passes, and it passes equally for everything. This certainty, however, emerges from a very specific context. The human body moves at extremely low speeds relative to the natural limits of the universe. It exists in regions where gravitational fields are stable and similar. Under these conditions, variations in the behavior of time are too small to be directly perceived. The regularity is not a universal rule, but a local coincidence. When this familiar scale is left behind, time begins to behave in ways that intuition does not anticipate. It ceases to be a uniform backdrop and becomes dependent on the conditions in which events occur. Motion and gravity are no longer just circumstances. They begin to influence the very rhythm of time. This idea is not intuitive because it has no direct parallel in everyday experience. Yet it emerges as an unavoidable consequence when reality is observed on broader scales. The first conceptual shock appears when it becomes clear that time does not flow the same way for all systems. Two identical processes, placed under different conditions, do not evolve in synchrony. This lack of synchronization is not a measurement error or a perceptual illusion. It is real. Time is not an entity independent of events. It is intertwined with them. Human intuition resists this idea because it challenges the notion of simultaneity. In daily life, it seems obvious that two events happening at the same time for one observer also happen at the same time for any other. This assumption works well in local environments, but it loses validity when extreme motion or intense gravitational fields are considered. Simultaneity ceases to be absolute and becomes dependent on context. This dependence profoundly transforms the structure of time. Past, present, and future stop being universal categories and become local relationships. What is present in one context may not be present in another. Time ceases to be a single thread running through all of reality and becomes a complex fabric where different rhythms coexist without a central standard. This fabric cannot be easily visualized because it does not correspond to any direct experience. The human mind naturally tries to translate these ideas into familiar images, but those translations always fail at some point. Relativistic time does not behave like a river flowing faster or slower. It is not something external that changes speed. It is part of the very structure of events. Once this is recognized, it becomes clear that the idea of a universal clock is merely a practical convention, not a feature of the cosmos. Clocks work well where they were created because they share similar conditions. Outside that context, the notion of a single time loses its foundation. Each system carries its own temporal rhythm, defined by the conditions in which it exists. This realization creates discomfort because it dissolves one of the fundamental pillars of human mental organization. If there is no universal time, then there is no single temporal order that applies to everything. Events cannot be arranged in one definitive sequence for the entire universe. Reality becomes more complex, less hierarchical, and less centered on human experience. This discomfort does not arise from mathematical difficulty, but from conceptual rupture. Time, for the human mind, has always been the axis around which everything is organized. Questioning its universality is, in a sense, questioning the very structure of the internal narrative used to make sense of reality. Yet this rupture becomes unavoidable as understanding expands. Another deeply counterintuitive aspect is the connection between time and gravity. In everyday life, gravity is experienced as a force pulling objects downward. Nothing about it suggests that it could influence the rhythm of time. Yet when local perspective is abandoned and gravity is understood as a structural property of reality, this influence becomes inevitable. Time responds to the presence of mass and energy. This response is neither symbolic nor abstract. The rate of processes changes. Systems subjected to different gravitational intensities do not age in the same way. This difference does not depend on perception or external reference. It occurs objectively. Time once again reveals itself as something that does not exist in isolation, but in direct relation to the state of the universe. The human mind struggles to accept this idea because it finds no echo in direct experience. In everyday life, variations are too small to be felt. The body ages uniformly, clocks appear to agree, and nothing suggests that time is being shaped by the environment. This absence of visible signs reinforces the illusion of uniformity. However, the absence of perception does not mean the absence of effect. The universe does not adjust itself to human sensory limits. It operates according to principles that remain active whether or not they are perceived. The regularity of time in everyday experience is a special case, not a general rule. This understanding demands a profound shift in how reality is conceived. Time ceases to be a stage upon which events unfold and becomes an active component of those events. It does not merely accompany processes, it participates in them. This participation is not optional or incidental. It is structural. As this idea is internalized, the concepts of past, present, and future also transform. These categories cease to be rigid compartments and become contextual relationships. What is past in one system may not be past in another. The future is no longer a universal direction, but a local possibility. The present is no longer a fixed point, but an experience dependent on specific conditions. This relativization does not eliminate the usefulness of these categories in everyday life. They remain essential for organizing human experience. The problem arises only when they are extended beyond the context in which they function. Human time is a local tool. just like the intuition that accompanies it. This distinction is essential to avoid conceptual confusion. It is not about denying the reality of lived time, but about recognizing that it does not exhaust the reality of time. There is a profound difference between what is experienced and what structures the universe. Confusing these two layers creates false expectations and unnecessary resistance to deeper understanding. Over time, this new perspective allows for a more serene relationship with the unknown. The universe is no longer judged for failing to behave according to human intuition, but is understood on its own terms. Time does not need to be simple to be coherent. It only needs to be consistent with the structure of reality. That consistency, though counterintuitive, reveals a quiet elegance. Time responds to the conditions of the universe with precision. It does not impose an arbitrary rhythm, nor does it exist as an independent entity. It emerges from the relationship between motion, gravity, and structure. This emergence is complex, but not chaotic. As this idea settles in, something shifts in the way one thinks about one's place in the cosmos. Human experience ceases to be the measure of all things and becomes one among many possible ways of relating to reality. The time we feel is not false, but it is local. It does not define the universe. It defines our experience within it. This acceptance does not diminish the value of human life. On the contrary, it situates it within a broader context, where the uniqueness of local experience becomes even more meaningful. To live within a specific rhythm in a particular temporal context is part of what makes human experience singular. There is no need to universalize it. At the end of this conceptual shift, it becomes clear that time is not what it once seemed. It is not a uniform flow passing equally through everything. It is a flexible dimension, shaped by the conditions of the universe. This flexibility is not a flaw of reality, but one of its deepest characteristics. And it is precisely this characteristic that prepares the ground for understanding why so many intuitive expectations fail when applied to the cosmos. If time is not absolute, then reality is not organized around a single axis shared by everything. It is organized through relationships, contexts, and structures that extend beyond human experience. This understanding does not end the mystery of time, but deepens it. Time ceases to be something that simply passes and becomes something that participates. It does not merely accompany events, it helps define them. And accepting this is another step in the long journey of letting go of local certainties in favor of a broader, more honest, and more contemplative vision of reality. For most of human history, what existed was, by definition, what could be perceived. The real coincided with the visible, the tangible, the audible. Even when something was not immediately accessible to the senses, its existence was inferred from direct and familiar effects. The world seemed composed only of what manifested itself in some clear way. This deep association between existence and perception quietly shaped the notion of reality. What does not appear does not count. What does not manifest does not participate. This association works well in everyday life. To survive, human beings needed to deal only with what interacted directly with the body. Predators, food, obstacles, shelter. Everything presented itself in a clear sensory way. Nothing required the conception of invisible entities influencing the environment indirectly. The world as perceived seemed complete. Reality seemed to coincide with what the senses could reach. This impression of completeness did not arise from naivety, but from sufficiency. The local environment did not require anything more. The human mind does not develop concepts for what is not necessary. If something does not interfere in a perceptible way, it does not enter the cognitive map. Thus, a silent but powerful idea takes shape. The universe is mostly made of what reveals itself. When this idea is extended to the cosmos, it produces a deeply incomplete view of reality. The universe begins to be imagined as a collection of luminous objects scattered across a vast space. Stars, planets, nebulae, and galaxies seem to compose nearly everything that exists. What shines appears to dominate. Darkness seems to be mere absence. This image is intuitive because it preserves human sensory logic. What is seen is what matters. However, this logic begins to break down when the behavior of the universe is observed on large scales. Movements that cannot be explained by visible matter alone. Structures that remain cohesive without an apparently sufficient source. Patterns of organization that do not match the distribution of what can be directly observed. These clues do not appear as isolated anomalies, but as a consistent pattern of mismatch between what is seen and what occurs. This mismatch demands a deep shift in the notion of reality. It becomes necessary to accept that what presents itself to the senses is not the totality of what exists. The universe comes to be understood as something in which the visible is the exception, not the rule. Most of reality does not manifest directly. It acts silently, indirectly, revealing itself only through consequences. This idea is profoundly counterintuitive because it breaks a basic association of human experience, that to exist is to appear. In everyday life, what does not manifest is usually irrelevant. In the cosmos, the opposite happens. What does not present itself directly is precisely what structures, sustains, and organizes much of what can be observed. The invisible ceases to be a detail and becomes a foundation. Accepting this requires abandoning the expectation that reality should present itself fully to human senses. The universe was not shaped to be entirely perceived by a local mind. It does not adapt to sensory limitations. It simply exists, operating according to principles that do not depend on being perceived to function. Human perception in this context reveals itself as a narrow window, not a faithful mirror. This realization does not imply mystical concealment or deliberate hiding. It is a direct consequence of the nature of interaction. Not everything that exists interacts in the same way with the matter that composes the human body. The senses capture only a very specific set of relationships. Beyond that set, reality continues to act, indifferent to the human capacity to perceive it. By recognizing this, the notion of the invisible must be redefined. Invisible does not mean non-existent. It simply means beyond the direct reach of perception. Just as waves can pass through the environment without being felt by the body, there are aspects of reality that traverse the cosmos without manifesting in a directly sensory way. They do not shine, do not reflect, do not emit perceptible signals, yet they profoundly influence the organization of the universe. This influence manifests structurally. It shapes trajectories, organizes large systems, and defines collective behaviors. Even without appearing, it participates. Even without being perceived, it acts. The mistake of human intuition has always been to associate action with visibility. In everyday life, that association works. In the cosmos, it fails. This failure is not a flaw of the mind, but a consequence of its evolutionary history. The human brain was shaped to deal with what presents itself directly. It was not prepared to infer entire layers of reality from subtle and distributed effects. Yet when confronted with consistent evidence, it is capable of expanding its notion of existence, even if this requires abandoning deeply rooted certainties. This expansion does not happen suddenly. It requires a slow conceptual re-education. The idea that most of the universe is invisible does not easily fit into everyday narratives. It challenges the sense of sensory completeness. The world ceases to be what appears and becomes what manifests both directly and indirectly. This shift also redefines the role of observation. To observe is no longer merely to register what appears, but to interpret effects, patterns, and deviations. Knowledge ceases to depend exclusively on sensory presence and begins to depend on explanatory coherence. What exists is what produces consistent effects, even if it never presents itself directly. This redefinition radically expands the concept of reality. The universe ceases to be a collection of perceptible objects and becomes a complex system of relationships, many of which entirely escape human senses. The visible becomes only a superficial layer of something much deeper. This depth is neither chaotic nor arbitrary. It follows regularities, patterns, and structures that can be understood, even without direct perception. The absence of sensory manifestation does not imply absence of order. On the contrary, many of the most stable structures in the universe depend precisely on what does not present itself directly. By accepting that most of reality is invisible, something quietly reorganizes in the way of thinking. The expectation that everything that matters must reveal itself dissolves. The unknown ceases to be a threat and becomes a natural condition of existence. The universe does not hide. It simply does not present itself according to human perceptual criteria. This acceptance also transforms the relationship with mystery. Mystery is no longer something that will eventually be revealed to the senses, but something that will be understood through inference, relation, and consistency. Not everything needs to be seen to be known. Not everything that exists needs to show itself to participate in reality. This posture requires intellectual patience and perceptual humility. The human mind must accept that its direct experience is only a minimal fraction of what exists. This acceptance does not diminish experience, it contextualizes it. The everyday world remains real, meaningful, and valid. It simply ceases to be complete. Over time, this understanding creates a quiet sense of expansion. The universe seems larger not only in size, but in depth. What once appeared empty reveals itself as full of invisible activity. What once seemed simple reveals itself as sustained by hidden layers of interaction. Reality gains thickness. This thickness is not accessible to the senses, but it is accessible to understanding. Knowledge begins to be built not from appearance, but from coherence. Reality ceases to be what shows itself and becomes what explains itself. This inversion is one of the deepest transformations in the relationship between humanity and the cosmos. With it comes a new form of belonging. The human being no longer feels isolated in a hostile universe, but recognizes itself as part of a much larger structure. Even if that structure does not present itself directly, the invisible ceases to be absence and becomes a silent presence. At the end of this conceptual shift, it becomes clear that most of the universe does not offer itself to human perception, and never will. This is not a flaw of the cosmos, nor a tragedy of knowledge. It is simply the way reality is. Accepting this means abandoning the expectation of sensory completeness and adopting a more honest posture toward what exists. The universe does not reduce itself to what can be seen, touched, or felt. It is sustained, in large part, by what remains beyond the direct reach of the senses. And recognizing this invisible reality does not distance humanity from the cosmos. On the contrary, it brings it closer to a deeper, calmer, and more truthful understanding of what has always been present, even when it did not show itself. There is a quiet difference between what the human brain is capable of imagining and what it is capable of truly understanding. To imagine is to project familiar images into expanded scenarios. To understand requires accepting structures that cannot be translated into direct experience. This difference is rarely noticed because, in everyday life, imagination is usually enough. The immediate world responds well to mental images built from sensory experience. But when the universe comes into view, that sufficiency begins to dissolve. The human brain did not evolve to deal with the infinite, with extreme scales, or with systems that exceed any biological reference. It was shaped to interpret local signals, make quick decisions, and construct coherent narratives from incomplete information. This is not an accidental limitation, but an adaptive advantage. A brain capable of reacting quickly to nearby dangers had a greater chance of survival than one devoted to abstract contemplation of reality as a whole. This origin deeply shapes how thought operates. The human mind prefers continuity over rupture, linearity over extreme complexity, closed narratives over open systems. It seeks familiar patterns and tends to reject what does not fit them. This behavior is not conscious. It happens as a cognitive reflex, an attempt to maintain internal stability when faced with stimuli that threaten the coherence of the existing model of the world. When the universe begins to be explored more deeply, this reflex comes into conflict with observed reality. The cosmos does not respect human scales. It does not organize itself according to biological expectations. It does not offer intuitive points of reference. Faced with this, the brain naturally tries to reduce the unknown to the known. It turns immense distances into abstract numbers, incomprehensible spans of time into vague metaphors, complex structures into simplified images. This process of reduction is inevitable, but also risky. It creates the illusion of understanding where there is only approximate translation. The mind feels it has understood something because it managed to associate the idea with a familiar image, even if that image does not accurately represent the phenomenon. Cognitive comfort replaces precision. The brain accepts the simplified version as sufficient, even when it deeply distorts reality. One of the greatest cognitive challenges when facing the universe is dealing with scales that have no equivalent in human experience. The brain works through comparison. It understands something by relating it to something already known. In everyday life, this works well. Distances can be compared to journeys. Time can be compared to biological cycles. In the cosmos, these comparisons lose meaning. There is nothing familiar to anchor them. The mind is left without support. When this happens, cognitive shortcuts emerge. The infinite is treated as merely very large. The extremely ancient is treated as merely very old. The complex is treated as merely complicated. These shortcuts allow the mind to keep functioning without collapsing, but they come at a cost. They mask the qualitative difference between human experience and cosmic reality. The universe is not just bigger, it is structurally different. Another critical point lies in how the brain handles probability and causality. In everyday life, cause and effect relationships are usually clear. An action produces a direct outcome. This clarity reinforces the idea of a predictable world where events follow an understandable order. In the cosmos, this predictability dissolves. Probabilistic processes, distributed interactions, and cumulative effects dominate. Causality becomes less direct and more statistical. The human brain struggles to accept explanations that do not point to a single identifiable cause. It prefers narratives with clear agents, defined events, and observable outcomes. When confronted with processes that emerge from the interaction of many factors, none of them dominant on their own, the mind becomes uncomfortable. It feels as if something is missing, even when the explanation is complete within its own framework. This discomfort often leads to the intuitive rejection of correct ideas, not because they are false, but because they do not satisfy the brain's narrative expectations. The universe does not tell stories in the way the human mind expects. It does not offer clear protagonists or definitive endings. It operates through regularities, not plots. This difference creates cognitive frustration. In addition, the human brain is strongly driven by the need for closure. It seeks conclusions. It feels uneasy with open-ended questions. In everyday life, this drive is functional. Solving problems quickly increases chances of survival. In the cosmos, this tendency becomes an obstacle. Many fundamental questions do not have final answers. They allow only provisional models, subject to continuous revision. Accepting this provisional nature requires cognitive maturity. It requires letting go of the expectation of absolute certainty. The human brain, however, tends to confuse lack of certainty with lack of knowledge. If something cannot be defined definitively, it appears incomplete, unstable, or unsatisfying. This tendency complicates the relationship with scientific knowledge, which advances precisely through successive approximations rather than final truths. Another important aspect is how the brain deals with deep abstraction. Concepts that cannot be visualized or directly experienced require a type of thinking that is not intuitive. They depend on symbols, mathematical relationships, and conceptual models. For the human mind, this represents significant effort. The brain prefers concrete images over abstract structures. When faced with deep abstractions, the brain tries to convert them into familiar images. This helps communication, but can distort understanding. Many ideas about the universe are accepted only superficially because they have been translated into metaphors that fail to capture their essence. The mind feels it has understood, but has actually replaced the concept with a comfortable image. This gap between real understanding and the feeling of understanding is one of the greatest challenges in the relationship between humanity and the cosmos. The brain does not clearly signal when it is only simulating comprehension. It provides a subjective sense of clarity even when the conceptual structure remains fragile. This can generate excessive confidence and resistance to later revision. At the same time, the human brain has an extraordinary capacity for conceptual adaptation. When repeatedly exposed to ideas that challenge intuition, it can gradually build new mental frameworks. This process is neither fast nor automatic. It requires time, repetition, and a willingness to live with uncertainty. But it is possible. The mind can learn to think beyond its original limits. This learning, however, does not eliminate local intuition. It places it in dialogue with other forms of understanding. Intuition continues to operate in everyday life, while abstract models begin to guide the understanding of the cosmos. The problem arises only when intuition is used as the sole tool to interpret a reality that requires different cognitive instruments. It is important to recognize that discomfort in the face of the universe is not a sign of intellectual incapacity. It is a sign of cognitive honesty. Feeling strangeness is natural when dealing with something that was not made to fit within the human mind. The problem is not the discomfort, but the refusal to accept it. When discomfort is denied, simplifying explanations emerge that preserve intuition but distort reality. By accepting the limits of the human brain, something reorganizes in the relationship with knowledge. The expectation of total mastery dissolves. In its place arises a more patient, open, and contemplative posture. The universe ceases to be a problem to be solved and becomes a system to be understood progressively, without any guarantee of final completion. This posture does not diminish the value of human knowledge. On the contrary, it strengthens it. Recognizing limits prevents the construction of false certainties. The human brain, by accepting that it was not shaped to comprehend the infinite, gains the freedom to use tools that go beyond intuition. These tools do not replace human experience, but expand it. They allow the construction of models that do not depend on familiar images, but on internal coherence and consistency with available data. This kind of understanding is less comfortable, but more honest. It does not promise immediate satisfaction, but it offers depth. Over time, this way of thinking transforms the emotional relationship with the universe. Strangeness ceases to be a threat and becomes part of the experience. The unknown does not need to be eliminated for the relationship to be meaningful. It can be welcomed as an essential component of reality. At the end of this process, it becomes clear that the greatest obstacle to understanding the universe is not the complexity of the cosmos, but the expectations the human brain projects onto it. Expecting reality to behave intuitively is a legacy of the local environment. Letting go of that expectation is a fundamental step toward expanding understanding. The human brain is not too small for the universe. It was simply not made to contain it entirely. And accepting this is not an intellectual defeat. It is an act of maturity. It is recognizing that reality is greater than any individual mind, and that understanding even a small part of it is, in itself, an extraordinary privilege. When it is accepted that human intuition is local, that observation is never immediate, that space is not neutral, that time is not uniform, and that much of reality does not present itself directly, a quiet question begins to emerge. How, then, is it possible to know the universe? The answer is, not found in abandoning human experience, but in extending it. Science arises precisely at this point, not as an opposition to common sense, but as its necessary continuation. From the beginning, science was not created to replace the senses, but to compensate for their limitations. Human senses function very well within the environment for which they were shaped. They fail only when reality exceeds that environment. Science does not treat this failure as a moral or intellectual flaw. It recognizes it as a condition, and from that recognition, it builds tools to go further. These tools are not only physical instruments, but methods of thought, to measure, to compare, to repeat, to isolate variables, to test hypotheses. All of this arises from the understanding that direct experience is insufficient to grasp the totality of reality. Science does not rely solely on what seems obvious. It is cautious of what appears too simple. This caution is not arrogance, but prudence. Over time, this posture has made it possible to access aspects of the universe that would never be perceived intuitively. Phenomena that do not manifest to the senses, processes that occur on scales incompatible with human life, relationships that do not follow linear narratives. Science does not make these phenomena emotionally familiar, but it makes them structurally understandable. It does not promise comfort. It offers coherence. It is important to understand that science is not born ready or final. It does not provide absolute truths. It builds models. These models are partial representations of reality, always open to revision. This openness is often mistaken for weakness when in fact it is its greatest strength. By accepting that knowledge is provisional, science avoids the rigidity that traps thought. This provisional nature does not mean absolute relativism. Scientific models are tested, compared, and refined. They must explain more than previous explanations with fewer contradictions. Progress does not occur through arbitrary replacement, but through expansion of scope. A new idea does not completely invalidate the previous one. It contextualizes it, showing where it worked and where it no longer applies. This way of advancing requires patience. There are no emotional shortcuts. Science does not conform to the human desire for quick answers. It operates at the pace of evidence, not expectation. This pace may feel frustrating to a mind accustomed to immediate intuition, but it is precisely what ensures consistency. Each step must stand on its own. Another essential aspect is that science does not depend on the authority of individuals, but on collective coherence. No idea survives simply because it feels elegant or intuitive. It must withstand criticism, repetition, and comparison. This process is slow, often imperfect, but deeply honest. It recognizes that error is part of the path, not a final failure. This honesty is often mistaken for coldness. Science is seen as distant from human experience, when in fact it emerges from it. The desire to understand, to explain, to expand horizons is deeply human. What changes is the method. Science asks that the desire to understand be disciplined, so it does not become a comfortable illusion. By doing so, science becomes an extension of the senses. Where the eye cannot reach, instruments record. Where human time cannot follow, records accumulate. Where intuition fails, abstract models provide structure. None of this eliminates human experience. On the contrary, it expands it into territories that would otherwise remain inaccessible. This expansion, however, comes with a psychological cost. It requires accepting that reality does not conform to human expectations. It demands letting go of the idea that understanding means making things familiar. Often, understanding means accepting the unfamiliar as it is, without forcing it into comfortable images. Science does not promise familiarity. It promises an honest approach. This honesty also redefines the role of doubt. In everyday life, doubt may appear as weakness or indecision. In science, it is a central tool. It prevents models from becoming rigid dogmas. It keeps thought in motion. To doubt does not mean to deny everything, but to continuously test what is believed to be understood. This constant testing creates a particular kind of trust. Not blind trust in absolute certainties, but trust in the process itself. Trust that, even without final answers, knowledge can deepen. Trust that error is part of the journey. Trust that reality does not need to be controlled in order to be respected. Over time, this posture transforms humanity's relationship with the universe. The cosmos ceases to be a hostile enigma or a distant stage and becomes a system that can be understood, even if never fully accessed. Science does not promise to exhaust the mystery. It promises to illuminate it, layer by layer. This illumination is neither uniform nor continuous. There are advances, revisions, apparent setbacks. There are moments of clarity and moments of confusion. This movement is often mistaken for failure, when it is actually a sign of vitality. Knowledge that does not change has stopped dialoguing with reality. It is essential to recognize that science does not oppose human intuition. It emerges exactly where intuition ceases to function. It respects intuition within its context and goes beyond it when necessary. Conflict arises only when one attempts to use a tool outside its proper function. Science does not deny everyday life. It contextualizes it. This contextualization also protects against comforting illusions. The human desire for meaning, purpose, and centrality can easily be projected onto the universe. Science acts as a counterbalance to these projections. It does not claim that the universe is indifferent out of cruelty, but out of observation. It does not remove meaning from human experience. It simply does not impose it where there is no evidence. This point is delicate because it touches deep expectations. Many hope that understanding the universe will provide final existential answers. Science does not offer that. It offers structural understanding, not ultimate meaning. This distinction is often a source of frustration, but also of liberation. The meaning of human experience does not need to be guaranteed by the cosmos to be valid. By accepting this, science ceases to be seen as a threat and becomes an ally. It does not compete with human experience. It protects it from dangerous illusions. It teaches limits not to diminish but to make the relationship with reality more honest. This honesty generates a particular kind of serenity, not the serenity of knowing everything, but of accepting not knowing everything. Science teaches that ignorance is not shame, but a starting point, that the unknown is not an enemy, but a territory for careful exploration. At the end of this path, it becomes clear that science is not a collection of answers, but a posture toward the universe, a posture that recognizes limits, accepts complexity, and advances without absolute guarantees. This posture is deeply human, even when dealing with realities that go beyond human experience. The universe does not become smaller when understood scientifically. It becomes larger, deeper, and quieter. Science does not close doors. It opens them one by one, knowing there will always be more beyond. And it is precisely this endless openness that makes science not an endpoint, but a continuous extension of the human gaze into the infinite. Throughout this entire journey, something has been quietly and steadily revealed, not as a final answer, nor as a closed conclusion, but as a shift in posture toward the universe. What once seemed strange at the beginning begins to feel natural. What once appeared as error reveals itself as limitation, and what once felt distant shows itself to be deeply connected to the human condition itself. To realize that intuition is local, that observation arrives delayed, that space participates, that time is not absolute, and that much of reality does not present itself directly, does not diminish the value of human experience. On the contrary, it places that experience within a broader context, where it no longer carries the burden of explaining everything. The universe does not require total understanding in order to exist. It does not ask permission from the human mind to be what it is. There is something profoundly calm in accepting this. When the need for certainty dissolves, space opens for contemplation. The cosmos ceases to be a problem to solve and becomes a continuous, silent, and coherent presence. Not understanding everything is not a failure. It is part of the experience. It is the natural condition of any finite mind facing an immense reality. At this point, the opening statement transforms. Everything you know about the universe could be wrong, not as an accusation, but as an invitation. An invitation to let go of rigid certainties, to accept that knowledge is always partial, situated and in constant construction. An invitation to replace the anxiety for final answers with a quiet curiosity for the process itself. Science throughout this path does not appear as a distant authority, but as a companion, a patient tool that extends the senses, organizes thought, and allows us to move beyond limits without denying human experience. It does not eliminate mystery. It makes it livable. It shows that it is possible to coexist with the unknown without fear, without urgency, and without the need to control everything. Perhaps the greatest insight is this: the universe does not move away when we recognize our limits. It comes closer. The relationship becomes more honest, less based on human expectations and more aligned with what reality actually offers. A vastness that cannot be fully explained, but that can be understood in parts, layer by layer, story by story. If this reflection has expanded your perspective even slightly, consider supporting this work with a like and subscribing to continue exploring these ideas. Here on Cosmos for Rest, you'll find a growing collection of calm, thoughtful journeys through astronomy, physics, and the deeper structures of reality. And if you know someone who would appreciate this kind of reflection, sharing it is a meaningful way to extend that experience. Knowledge does not need to be rushed. The cosmos does not demand urgency. It remains there, quiet and constant, as we slowly learn how to relate to it with greater humility and contemplation. Good night. Sleep well.